To Stokes, who's onside. 1-0.
Here's Sims. It's a good search this from Southampton. They could finish the job here. It's Shane Long, and he has done it.
Just a minute to play, plus stoppage time. Here's Tissier. Oh, better to say farewell than one of the finest players ever to wear the red and white.
Hello and welcome to the Saints FC podcast. As always, if you do like what you hear on the Saints FC podcast, please get onto iTunes and give us a review. Tell all of your Saints supporting friends to do exactly the same and download the podcast and subscribe and listen and give us any feedback that you want. Of course, you can email the podcast as well, saintsfcpodcast@gmail.com, or get us on Twitter @saintsfcpodcast. So it's international break at the moment. We've got a slightly different guest here, and I don't have Tom sat alongside me or my brother doing a Saints analysis. We actually have Michael Cox, who some of you may recognise his voice. So hello, Michael. Welcome to the Saints FC podcast.
Hi, John. Thank you very much for having me on.
So Michael Cox, you may know being the man behind zonalmarking.net. He's written for all sorts of football websites, including ESPN and The Guardian. And he's a regular pundit on the Total Football Show with the famous AC Jimbo for those of us who remember the Italia 90. Also behind the Mixer podcast. And I suppose most importantly, and what we're here really to talk about today, Michael Cox is the author of a book called The Mixer. Michael, welcome to the show. And I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about your book.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, the book was released to coincide with the 25th anniversary of the Premier League, and it's essentially a history of the Premier League, but looking at things from a tactical perspective. I guess anything that happens on the pitch, really, nothing to do with the kind of business side of the Premier League, which I think people focus on a lot when they talk about, the money that's come into the game, the broadcasting. This is just everything that happens on the pitch. So the great teams, the great players, the game changes in terms of managers. And it's out now. Yeah.
I was very lucky to receive this book from my wife as a birthday present. It's a bit of a Bible, it's a hefty book. But it's a really brilliant read. And, for people my age, like I remember the Premier League starting. And, it really is a journey through probably my entire history of watching the Premier League. And I think anyone who's kind of watched the Premier League from 1992 onwards is going to find it fascinating. The tactical insights as well is something that you don't often get in the kind of depth that you do that, whether it's on Match of the Day or whether it's in normal match reports. And this really came from your website, zonalmarking.net. Is that where it all started? And can you tell us, what was the idea behind that and how did that get going?
Yeah, I mean, it pretty much came from that. The website I started in 2010, so a while ago now. Just really a bit of a protest of the lack of kind of in-depth analysis on football games. Really I follow two sports. I follow football and cricket, and I always thought football analysis was way, way behind cricketing analysis in terms of statistics, but also just in terms of looking in depth at what players are trying to do and what teams are trying to do. So, there was a lot more tools you could use in terms of stats and graphics, and I tried to put those to use, really.
Yeah. And you don't have a footballing background in the way that, Alan Shearer or Gary Lineker has come along. Was this just a hobby which you turned into something bigger?
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, it was an ambition to go into journalism, really. Yeah. And, with the internet, with blogs and with Twitter to a certain extent, I think the way to get yourself in there is basically just go and do it. And if people like what they read, then they'll keep on coming back, and hopefully that can lead to bigger things. So yeah, a little bit of a hobby, but also there was an ambition to hopefully end up doing something like this as well.
Yeah. So let's get into the book. So it covers 25 years of the Premier League, few kind of interesting kind of tactical things come out of it. And we'll talk about the book more generally, but I want to start with the Southampton focused stuff, if that's all right. And really the first kind of proper mention that Southampton get, and a man who really lit up the early seasons of the Premier League, is Matthew Le Tissier. And then particularly Matthew Le Tissier playing in Alan Ball's Saints, which many of the listeners of this podcast will remember fondly, a time when Alan Ball built the side around Matt Le Tissier and he just seemed to score all the time.
Yeah, I mean, I think Le Tissier might be the most popular player of the Premier League era in the sense that no one disliked him. You know, he was a kind of everyone, you know, the neutral's favourite player, if you like. And yeah, it was great to go back to, I guess, his glory years at Southampton. You know, there were many glory days, but particularly that spell under Alan Ball. And, you know, as I'm sure some of the listeners will be aware, he's done some great interviews, quite in-depth interviews where he talks about when Alan Ball first comes in. And Le Tissier had really been suffering under Ian Bramford, who, you know, much more of a kind of Route 1 guy or balls into channels guy.
Yeah.
And that obviously didn't suit Le Tissier's style. He was in and out of the side. And then Alan Ball arrived and, you know, he got the players together on the training ground first day and arranged 10 players on, you know, almost in a mini formation. And Le Tissier was stood there thinking, oh, God, I'm not going to get into the team again. And then Alan Ball just got him and placed Le Tissier at the centre of this team and said, this is your best player, get the ball to him whenever you can. And essentially gave licence to Le Tissier to go where he wanted to go. And, you know, to this day, I'm not sure there's many players in the Premier League that have enjoyed such a free role, to the extent that I was having a very boring debate with some people the other day about what constitutes a midfielder and what constitutes a forward. And I think Le Tissier is one of the few players who's a genuine in-betweener. Yeah. But he always says that in that Alan Ball side, he was a midfielder. And that's where he was best, because he could pick the ball up from deep and could create. And, of course, could score some spectacular long-range goals as well.
And he was absolutely prolific during that time. I mean, I don't have the stats to hand, but
I think it's 45 goals in 65 games.
Yeah, which is astonishing from midfield.
Yeah, and especially at that time when... you know, the goals per game rate was slightly low in the Premier League then. Yeah. It wasn't quite so open. Yeah.
And interestingly, when Alan Ball left Southampton, which I think, you know, a lot of us at Southampton were very disappointed when that happened, and I'm sure Matthew Le Tissier would have been heartbroken when he left, and he realised he had to play under a different system and a different manager, and one that wouldn't necessarily build the team around him. And when he went to Man City, he tried to do something similar.
Yeah, very similar with a similarly gifted player, Georgie Kinkladze, who was, you know, for those too young to remember him, was just an astonishingly talented Georgian player who idolised Maradona. I don't think it's unfair to say that stylistically he was maybe more similar to Messi in the sense he was left-footed, often coming from the right, incredible dribbler. And he was Alan Ball's first signing. And Ball pretty much did a similar thing, but the problem with Kinkladze was that this was his first taste of English football. He didn't speak a word of English. He was living in this hotel on the outskirts of Manchester, didn't know anyone, completely unhappy, didn't get the English game. And when he produced moments of magic, it was absolutely incredible. And, you know, I think probably his most famous goal was against Southampton.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think most Southampton fans yes. will be familiar with Kinkladze because every time you get a highlights reel, you think, oh, it's going to be a programme about the Premier League's greatest goals. Brilliant, I'm going to watch this. There'll be at least a dozen Le Tissier ones, but there's always that Kinkladze one against us. Yeah,
always flicking the ball over Dave Besant's head. But sadly, you know, because of these problems with Kinkladze bedding in, you know, Ball didn't really know what system to play. He played 4-3-1-2. He tried playing him from the right. He tried playing him up front, and it didn't work. And City went down, and, you know, the amazing thing is they went down again. So they went down 2 tiers with this incredible player who, you know, retains such a great reputation that he went to Ajax when he left City. And this is Ajax, who'd been in the European Cup final 2 years before. Yeah. So he was a fantastic player. But it just goes to show that, you know, for some players it really worked, you know, that kind of number 10 mould. Zola and Bergkamp, I guess, the obvious examples. And then you have players like Kinkladze and Juninho, who were arguably as talented, but, you know, those teams just couldn't really find the right system.
Yeah. And you go into a lot of depth around the positions of the players in your book. And Le Tissier part comes up in the number 10 role. Do you think that is kind of really what his role was? Or, I mean, I suppose it varied over his time at Southampton, but is that where he had his biggest impact in your view?
Yeah, it's a funny one. I guess number 10 was his average position, but he was sometimes more of a second forward, sometimes more of a midfielder. Yeah, I'd say he was as close as you can get in English football over the last 25 years to a proper number 10. And I think it's telling that him, more than other players, he really speaks about the fact that managers needed to build a team around him. And he's quite bitter that, when Glenn Hoddle was England manager, and Hoddle was a manager who admired players like that because that was the type of player he was, that he didn't really give Tissier a chance. There was that game against Italy, famously, when we lost 1-0, when Tissier didn't actually play badly. In fact, I watched the game back. I think he was probably England's liveliest player. But I just think because the team was built around him for that one game and we lost, the media were onto Hoddle. I think Hoddle probably lost faith in him. And I think that seemed to hit Tissier quite hard because, he was a player who, as has been well documented, didn't want to leave Southampton. And so, the obvious step for him was becoming a regular for England. And he got, was it 7 caps in the end?
It was, something really, really abysmal.
Which is such a shame.
And not fitting for the type of player that he is. And I suppose it's interesting, if you watch the last 2 England games, the 2 qualifiers that we won 1-0 in both of them, we seem to really be lacking a Tissier type player, someone who can somehow make that connection to the forward line. And England at the moment kind of remind me a little bit of Southampton at the moment, in that frustrating kind of lack of quality and getting the quality balls or quality chances from midfield.
Yeah, I agree completely. And I think England's key player actually is another former Southampton player, which is Adam Lallana. Yeah, because he's the only one who gets those passing combinations going. I think in the Euros last year, I think he was England's best player in those first 2 games. I think England really missed him for the next 2. So yeah, it's a similar kind of thing. If Lallana's not playing, we do lack a midfield creator. Obviously, we've got Dele Alli, who I think is increasingly becoming more of a second striker going in behind. But in terms of someone getting their foot on the ball and dictating the rhythm, again, it's I think Lallana is just invaluable for England.
Yeah, and I don't know whether this is unfairly or not, but I think a lot of Southampton fans really felt like Lallana could have been the next Tissier. And there's still a lot of heartbreak about him leaving for Liverpool. He didn't really help the matter by coming out and saying, just a couple of weeks before he signed for Liverpool, that he wanted to stay at Southampton and see his career out there, which seems to be rather ill-informed, considering what happened after that. But interesting that you mentioned Lallana. He's someone that we watched come up from League One into the Championship and then excel at the Premier League and then get his chance for England as well. And Richard Chaplow, who I interviewed for last week's pod, he mentioned Adam Lallana as that one player that Southampton couldn't have done without during that time. And I suppose it's very interesting to see how these key sort of creative players really can sometimes be the difference between a good and a bad team.
Yeah, I think he's a wonderful player. And, I must say, when it must have been 2011, I think, when the rumours were starting to emerge that Arsenal were interested in signing Oxlade-Chamberlain. Yeah. And I remember speaking to my friend Alec, who's a big Southampton fan, and he was saying, Oxlade-Chamberlain is a good player, but this Lallana, he'll definitely be a regular for England. Yeah. And this was when you were in League One. I was like, well, he's already 23 or something. I can't ever imagine he'll be a regular for England. But 3 or 4 years later, he's the kind of player that, because he doesn't have that searing pace, I think maybe as a youngster, those kind of players get overlooked. Yeah. But he just brings a different kind of vibe to the way that teams play, I think. And maybe not so much with Liverpool because they're always really high tempo and about pressing. But for Southampton, he was a joy to watch. And for England as well. He's just a very kind of un-English player, I think. Yeah.
It's funny that you mention Oxlade-Chamberlain there as well, because he actually was a wonderful player for Southampton, as was Theo Walcott. And there's a little bit of me that kind of thinks, did both of them leave Southampton too early? And I don't know if either of them have ever reached the potential that we saw at Southampton, because they were up there with the Gareth Bales and the Adam Lallanas as well.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, for me, 2 different cases. I think Theo Walcott's basically been a very solid, consistent player for Arsenal over the years. Maybe I think being included in that World Cup squad before he played a Premier League game was ludicrous and just meant that expectations were blown out of proportion. But his goal scoring records, particularly if you look at kind of minutes per goal rather than games, because he's subbed on and off quite a lot, but he's actually quite prolific, Walcott. Oxlade-Chamberlain I found really frustrating. I wrote an article for ESPN about a month ago that seemed to go down quite well, where I'm intrigued by the fact he played a lot of rugby when he was a kid, and I always think that he plays football almost in a rugby manner, in the sense that he's basically a ball carrier. He doesn't really look to play kind of penetrative passes or forward passes. He kind of gets the ball and charges into space, and then when there's a tackle, he kind of either just kind of like tries to speed past them or just kind of offloads the ball sideways.
Yeah.
And it's almost like he's still got that rugby mentality, because I think his footballing brain, for want of a better word, is not there. But, you know, physically and in terms of athleticism and in terms of his attitude as well, he's clearly a nice guy, professional guy, dedicated guy. But in terms of his actual technical improvement at Arsenal, I think was pretty limited, really.
Yeah. I wonder if any of that has to do with Clive Woodward being at Southampton at the time. He had his formative years there. Okay, well, let's move on to another thing which comes up in your book, and I suppose it won't be a surprise to anyone that you write quite a lot about Pochettino, his pressing style, and obviously you talk about Southampton, but you also talk about Tottenham Hotspur. What did you think when Pochettino arrived on the scene in the Premier League, and why did he inspire so many words in your book and so much interest and intrigue? Well,
I must say the first thing is I'm still not convinced it was the right decision to appoint him. And I realise this is a debate from about 4-5 years ago now. But I thought getting rid of Nigel Adkins at that point was very strange, because I know it had been a difficult start to the campaign, but there was a big upswing in performances. And when Pochettino comes in with such a completely different philosophy, it was such a big risk at a time when I'm not sure Southampton had to take a risk. I'm not sure what your view is on that, but I'd be interested to know.
Certainly at the time, the mood in Southampton was, oh my God, what have we become? We've sacked a manager who has done really, really wonderful things for us. Getting that double promotion, always seemed like a really, really lovely guy. And you're right, maybe in the first few weeks, things weren't going particularly well. But I think at the time we sacked him, we'd only lost, once in a run of about 10 or 12 games.
Yeah, completely, yeah.
And, we were starting to look a lot better. And, we found it quite bizarre when we sacked him. But then I suppose perhaps we shouldn't have been so surprised, because we did sack Alan Pardew after we beat Bristol Rovers 4-0.
Yes, I remember that, yeah. That was an interesting one, yeah.
So, clearly Southampton have a bit of a ruthless streak. A lot of people, although I think the general opinion was against Claude Puel, probably if you look at it on the kind of bare bones of it, it seems a bit harsh to sack a manager who's got you to 8th in the division and got you to a cup final, and also had your team beat Inter Milan, although the exit from the Europa League was pretty turgid and a pretty sorry affair.
Yeah. I mean, to be honest, my first thought with Pochettino was surprised that he was being appointed. He'd obviously impressed with Espanyol, but impressed in terms of star rather than results. I think he left them bottom of the table. They would play all-out attack against Barcelona and look great for 20 minutes and then lose 5-1.
Yeah.
So he was that kind of manager. But, I mean, to be fair, from the outset, it was obvious that the players were on board. I remember that first game. Was it against Hull, maybe? Might be making this up. It was a Monday night game. And just it was clear from the moment he got, the players on the training ground that they were just going to work and they were going to do what he wanted, and that was pressing high up. And, the emphasis upon pressing is a relatively modern concept, I think, in the Premier League. Obviously, there was a craze about it in the 1980s. But even 6 or 7 years ago, there weren't many managers who I think would really base their system around pressing. And then you had Pochettino come in and, obviously he's achieved a lot more success at Tottenham in terms of getting them high up the league, but the pressing was so much more aggressive at Southampton, and it was like that was the main concept of their game.
Yeah.
They were winning the ball high up. They had a couple of great creative players, but it was the number one thing about their game, which I don't think we'd really seen in English football, with the exception maybe of Andre Villas-Boas, who obviously went wrong for him at both Chelsea and Tottenham. So I think people were quite sceptical of whether that could work in English football.
Do you think perhaps that Pochettino coming in with a side like Southampton that had a double promotion, had players that didn't have a glittering past career and perhaps opinions above their station, meant that he was able to form Southampton into a more effective force than perhaps Andre Villas-Boas had to do at Chelsea or at Tottenham. Because I think with a high pressing game, if one player doesn't do their job properly, then it all starts to fall to pieces quite quickly.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, he clearly had a good squad there, and good squad not just in terms of the technical qualities, but just in terms of the attitude in the squad. I think it's obvious from particularly the type of player that Southampton produces through their academy that they're not just very good technically, but they are nice guys, and they're not troublemakers, and they are, I think, willing to learn is the main thing, because Pochettino comes in with this completely new philosophy really to a lot of the players, and they just got on board with it so quickly. And it took a while for the results to pick up really, but it was interesting that I think his first 3 wins were against 3 really big teams. Certainly City, Chelsea, maybe Liverpool, and then at the same time they were struggling against the bottom half teams. So it was almost like they needed, teams playing out from the back and trying to play football to then press it, because obviously you can't really press long ball football. Yeah,
I think it was Manchester City, Liverpool, and Chelsea. So
okay, yeah, and then in the middle you were losing to QPR and Newcastle
United. Yeah,
just goes to show the contrast, and drawing at Wigan and Norwich. So it was really those first few weeks. It was, working against the big teams, but not against, the teams at that point that Southampton were competing against really.
And the following season with Pochettino went, remarkably well, I think. And we were doing really well, kind of flying up the league table, had a really fantastic start to the season. And for a little while, it looked like we might even break into the Champions League and qualify into that. I mean, what were you thinking about Pochettino's tactics at that point? Was he really starting to impress from the tactical perspective?
Yeah, definitely. I remember being amazed at how good the football was. I went down to St Mary's to see, I think, a game against Hull again, where it was a 4-1 win and Lallana scored a really good goal, and just everything came together so well. And I think that was the game just after it had been announced that Southampton had 4 players maybe in the England squad. Yeah. And, even now we look at it, I think the stat is 15 of the last 30 England debutants have played under Pochettino. And I think the interesting thing is with him is that it's quite an English strategy, even though the pressing wasn't in vogue 10 years ago. Just being energetic and being direct and closing down high up the pitch, I think does come naturally to English players. In terms of, as you said, or as you were kind of implied, only finished 8th, I think, that season. Yeah. But, stylistically, for me, someone looking at tactics, it was really fascinating because it was a completely different style of football to how everyone else was playing.
And do you think tactically he's stepped up since he's moved to Tottenham Hotspur?
Yes, although I think the funny thing is, I think he clearly saw Southampton as a stepping stone. I think a couple of interviews he gave, he was quite open and quite blunt about that, to be honest.
I think we're quite used to that from our managers.
I imagine. But it was almost like he was being really extreme at Southampton to attract the interest of a bigger club. And if he was completely, if it was his pinnacle of his managerial career, maybe he would have been a little bit more intelligent and reserved at Southampton. But he basically just wanted to get the attention of a bigger club. And I was looking at the stats for that season when I was researching the book. And I found this really interesting. They had, Southampton in 2013-14 had the highest possession share in the league, but only the 8th highest pass completion rate, which I find really interesting because you'd usually think those two things would go hand in hand. Yeah. But Southampton were giving the ball away quickly, but then just winning it really quickly.
I mean,
so
we did have Victor Wanyama in the side at the time. Which...
yeah. In fact, that game against Hull, Wanyama had one of the worst games I've ever seen. Just 4 or 5 times he played crossfield passes straight to opposition players. I think he got subbed off in the second half.
Yeah.
But it was incredible. It took me about 2 years after that for me to realise he was actually a good player. Yeah. Because I couldn't get that display out of my head. It was incredible.
I have a very similar feeling about Wanyama. And I might say that the best 45 minutes I've ever seen of Southampton, perhaps, maybe you could argue the 4-0 win against Arsenal on Boxing Day could take this, but we were drawing 0-0 with Fulham at Craven Cottage. Okay. And for the whole first half, Wanyama hadn't completed a pass in my memory. And Pochettino took him off at half-time and then second half, we ended up winning 3-0. And Lambert, Lallana and Rodriguez played the most astonishing football. And this was a time when, it looked like England were going to go into the World Cup with the front three being the Southampton front three.
Yeah.
And it was so exciting. And really the whole game changed on Wanyama coming off and not giving away the ball. So, that might explain that particular statistic.
Yeah, that does ring a bell, yeah. And, I mean, I think the underrated player in that system, probably not amongst Southampton fans, but maybe neutrals, is Lambert.
Yeah.
I mean, what a great player he was, not just in terms of... I think because he came up through the divisions, people thought he was just a kind of old-fashioned number 9, but his link-up play with Lallana and Rodriguez going in behind him was just fantastic. And it's a shame that his career slightly petered out after that. It didn't quite work at Liverpool because, I remember him being probably second to Lallana in terms of the players that I just really enjoyed watching for Southampton at that period.
Yeah, I mean, he was a truly wonderful player for Southampton. And when he joined from Bristol Rovers, he was your typical number 9. He was maybe a little bit squidgy around the edges. He knew how to finish. He was a wonderful finisher. But something happened in his time at Southampton. We used to find him quite frustrating. Despite all of the goals, you heard fans getting on his back a little bit in the stadium. Until Adkins came in, he really started to seem to work Lambert into a much more complete player. And then I think Pochettino took him on another level. It was devastating to see the way his career went after the move to Liverpool.
Yeah, no, it was a real shame. But I liked, he retired, was it last week?
Last week.
I really liked his statement, kind of, got to play at a World Cup in Brazil. It's like, well, yeah, fair enough. That's not bad for someone who spent 10 years in League One.
Yeah. Okay, so let's move on and we'll go for Koeman, because I think you've probably had a chance to see Koeman a fair bit in his 2 seasons at Southampton. You've seen a bit of him at Everton as well. What do you make of him tactically? Do you think he has his own tactical style, or is he a bit more of a pragmatist?
Somewhere in between. I think naturally he comes from that Ajax school, probably more the Johan Cruyff school in terms of letting players express themselves rather than the Van Gaal style, which is really about systems and every player's a number rather than individual. And I think sometimes that, obviously he won the league a couple of times with Ajax, but I think managers, because Ajax has just got such a kind of ingrained philosophy, I think sometimes managers struggle to do it elsewhere, and we saw that with Frank de Boer, most obviously. I think that's a massively extreme example, but I kind of think it applies to Koeman as well. And I think his Southampton team was weird in a way because I always struggled to really define it. I think it was just a watered-down Pochettino side. He inherited a very well-drilled team. It wasn't as extreme in terms of the pressing. Not sure he added that much in terms of giving more in the final thirds. It just seemed a little bit of a... Felt like Southampton were doing an impression of themselves of the previous season, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think maybe you're right in the fact that it was less pressing, and perhaps he was not like Pochettino trying to show off a particular style to get poached by a bigger club, but maybe a little bit more pragmatic. He did seem to change his tactics around a little bit, but there wasn't really a great change from Pochettino to Koeman. And one of the things that I noticed with Koeman is that when we were on a good run, we were wonderful to watch. The players played with incredible confidence. Mane was, brilliant under him. Tadic and Pella all seemed to be able to really express themselves under Koeman. But then, if we had a bad run, he just didn't seem to be able to figure out how to stop them.
Yeah, I know. I completely agree with that, and I always found him slightly strange. I mean, I try not to judge managers on press conferences because that's what every journalist does, and it's boring. But he never seemed to really give off the air he knew how to make things better.
Yeah.
If there was a problem, I was never sure that Koeman had the fix for it. But equally, I never got the impression that it was ever going to lead to disaster.
Yeah.
It was always just going to be okay. And I've struggled to really make up my mind about Koeman, really. I don't think he's a great manager. I don't think he's a terrible manager. I think he's probably needs the right kind of environment and the right circumstances. And to a certain extent, I think Southampton probably was the right circumstances. Yeah. But, in terms of results, I think, did he finish 7th under him? I think I'm right in saying.
We had 7th and then 6th.
7th and then 6th. So it was improvement both years from the Pochettino years. Albeit Pochettino only had one whole season. But you probably don't remember it as fondly. So it's a funny one.
Well, I think we have moments that we remember really, really fondly, like the turning around the game against Liverpool and beating them 3-2 at St Mary's, beating Sunderland 8-0. I mean, that was a ruthless streak that we've probably not ever seen in a Southampton side before. And beating Arsenal 4-0 on Boxing Day, which was one of the most bizarre days, really, because I think we'd had a run where we hadn't won a game in 8 matches.
Yes.
And then up pops Cuco Martina, who, if you've ever seen him play, is possibly one of the worst fullbacks to have ever graced the Premier League. Unleashing, what should have been goal of the season. I think he got second in the end.
I agree. That was an incredible goal. And a really odd game as well, because, I mean, Arsenal in quite good form going into that, I think I'm right saying. Southampton in dreadful form. So, incredible game.
I think it was Shane Long really was the person that made that 4-0 happen. He was bullying the Arsenal players, and so sometimes Shane Long can really do that and be really, really effective, and sometimes he can be really ineffective. Yeah,
he's one of the most inconsistent players I've come across, and yet I still really like him because maybe like 3 times a season you'll watch him and he's just brilliant. He kind of, his movement is great. He's kind of a bit of a battler as well. His touch inside the box can be fantastic, but can also completely desert him.
And do you think Koeman's going to last at Everton, or do you think, I have some Everton supporting friends that think he's been found out and think it was only Mane which made him look good?
I wouldn't completely go along with that, but I'm struggling to see what his plan is at Everton, and I think it's actually a really bad team they've assembled. So many slow players, so many number 10s. I don't think you can have 2 of Klaas and Sigurdsson and Rooney in the team, let alone 3. And, this is a guy who came through the ranks at Ajax. And, they always have ball players, of course, at Ajax. But they have width and they have directness down the flanks. And unless they play the lad Calvert-Lewin up front, or Lookman to a certain extent on the flank, who I think is okay. I don't think he's great. They just play in front of teams. And I think it's a bit of a shame, really, because it would be good to have a bit of a challenge to the top 6, but I don't think it's going to come from Everton.
Yeah. Right, let's get into the meaty tactical stuff. I'm going to start with a really annoying question, probably for you, because you'll think of hundreds of them, won't want to narrow it down, but what have been, the biggest developments in tactics in the Premier League?
I mean, it's a very broad question. I mean, you can see the size of that book, but...
I mean, this could be the opportunity where you say, well, if you want to know that,
exactly.
Go out and buy The Mixer by Michael Cox.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting one because you can look at it in various different ways. I mean, if you look at it in terms of formations, I think there was a big shift when the aforementioned number 10s came in, Cantona, Bergkamp, Zola, and teams stopped playing 2 up front, really, and had 1 behind and an out-and-out forward. I think that was a very big shift. There was also a shift when Jose Mourinho came and played 4-3-3 and won the league. Won the league with a record amount of points, and it felt like within half a season no one was playing even that number 10. Everyone was kind of packing 3 central midfielders in. And then the most recent formation innovation has been Antonio Conte and to a certain extent Pochettino playing 3 at the back, and now I think by the end of last season 17 of the 20 teams played 3 at the back, which I think 5 years before that only 1 had played 3 at the back, and that was Roberto Martinez at Wigan, who didn't inspire much in terms of the defensive side of things. But then there's also, you can look at tactics in terms of the individual positions that have come and gone. Remember people fussing over the Makelele role when he first came to England to play for Chelsea. You had a big emphasis upon fullbacks pushing forward, on ball playing centre backs, on wingers cutting inside, playing on the opposite side to their stronger foot, and emphasis upon forwards linking play. So you can look at tactics in that kind of way. But then there's also just some quite fundamental shifts that I think are maybe overlooked. And one of those is, again, 3rd time I've referred to him in this answer, but Mourinho and Chelsea. And Mourinho came to England at the same time as Benitez came to Liverpool. They'd both just won European trophies. And they just did things a completely different way in terms of basing their entire game plan around the opposition. And you speak to any footballer, speak to most footballers from the 1990s, even like that Newcastle team under Keegan, they didn't mention the opposition once. He'd read out the team sheet just before, when he got the team sheet, half an hour before the game. But the idea that they would work on something in training to exploit the weaknesses of the opposition is completely foreign to them. And then you've got Mourinho, who comes in, who basically gets his most trusted coach, which is Andre Villas-Boas, to be an opposition scout. He's not coaching the players, he's an opposition scout, trying to find weaknesses in the opposition, gives the players a kind of 6-page dossier every Wednesday on the weaknesses in the opposition. And you've got Benitez, who subjects his players to these, lengthy, intense video sessions on, gaps in the opposition. You have a massive change in terms of the way that teams are approaching games. And I think while that probably made the Premier League a little bit boring at that time, the games between the big sides were always 0-0, 1-0s. But it also coincided with, for the first time, English teams really dominating the Champions League, because I think that was probably the biggest step forward in terms of the tactics. They start to get tactics. It's not just about your team. You've got to look at the opposition, study the opposition, and have players that are willing to follow instructions.
So, you mentioned Mourinho quite a few times in that. Is he probably the manager that has had the biggest influence on the Premier League then in the 25 years?
In terms of being a revolutionary, I think possibly, because he came in, he just injected something that we hadn't massively seen before. He was just an overnight success. There's no doubt about that. What I found, and this was probably inevitable, but midway through the book I realised that, there was a hell of a lot of Sir Alex Ferguson in there. And he was never really an innovator, but he always stayed not ahead of the game, but roughly up with the game, and obviously had a fantastic squad at United. So, I think overall Ferguson was clearly the biggest managerial influence on the Premier League. But the Premier League has depended so much upon foreign influence. Mourinho certainly, and going back before that, Wenger and his, people talk about the diet and the kind of professionalism, but also just in terms of the way they played the game. They counter-attacked. They weren't long ball. They filled the team with technical players. Yeah. And, even the managers at the top of the league now, there are no English managers at the top of the league. It's all foreign managers, all broadly representing their own kind of nation styles, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned Arsene Wenger there, because in all the years of watching Southampton at St Mary's and all the opposition teams that we've had, that invincible side that Arsenal had, I still think is the best team I've ever seen play at St Mary's. And I think the match is famous for Thierry Henry missing an open goal from about 15 yards out, which was hilarious. And they won 2-0, but really they could have beaten us 6 or 7-0 that day.
Yeah, it was a fantastic team. And it's an obvious thing to say, but no team had gone unbeaten for over 100 years, and it's a remarkable thing. There were a lot of good teams of that era. When the big four, as people used to say then, were really strong. The next year Chelsea only lost one game all season, which was remarkable. And then I think 3 years after that. Yeah, 3 years after that was that United team that won the European Cup. Yeah, and that was Ronaldo's peak year for United. So I think those three teams really stand out, and that's within 5-year period. I think probably they were the best three teams of the Premier League era.
Okay, and another thing I'd like to kind of quiz you on a little bit is tactical surprises. So, for example, someone changing up the system to try and gazump the opposition. And have you seen some interesting examples of that?
Yeah, maybe not historically, difficult to pick ones out, but I think that's what Guardiola's done repeatedly this season. To the extent that other managers are now adapting their team, adapting their formation to suit what they think Guardiola will do, and he's then maybe deliberately moving away from it. So that was very obvious in that game at Bournemouth. That actually City struggled to win and only won late on with that Sterling goal. But City had been playing three at the back until then. Eddie Howe changed his system to play three at the back and match them for wing-backs. And then that's the first time that Guardiola plays a back four this season. So he's always trying to stay one step ahead, always trying to keep the opposition guessing. And I think, to be fair, sometimes he overdoes it. I think sometimes he can overcomplicate things. And I think the players he's got at City are maybe not as intelligent as the players at Bayern and Barcelona. But he's clearly someone who, for all the emphasis upon a clear philosophy and a Barcelona way of playing, is actually very much a tactician and is constantly trying to get one over on the opposition manager.
And I wonder if you have a kind of favourite game that you can look back at as a real tactical masterclass? Two great managers fighting it out between each other, maybe a couple of different tactical changes throughout the game that really stands out for the tactical purist.
In terms of decisive changes, it's maybe not an obvious choice, and maybe not a very popular answer considering you're a Southampton fan. But I remember a couple of times Harry Redknapp at Tottenham was just fantastic at changing the game. There was a game at the Emirates in 2010, I think. Yes, 2010-11, when Tottenham were 2-0 down at half-time and playing 4-4-1-1. And he changed things just by putting Defoe on for, I think, Aaron Lennon. Van der Vaart went right. And just the fact that Tottenham now had pace in behind just completely stretched Arsenal. It meant there was space between the lines. Arsenal were kind of not compact at all. And that was a real big theme for Redknapp. He wasn't a tactician in terms of a Benitez, someone who would study the opposition on video for a week. But I think something about him, he did kind of have a clear idea of what was happening in the pitch in front of him. He was quite good at making in-game changes, but not so good at, devising starting lineups.
I've got to admit, I didn't think in a discussion about tactics, Harry Redknapp would come up at all. Yeah,
he's a surprise choice, but it's funny because I think there's a massive difference between someone like him and someone like Benitez in terms of the way they present themselves.
Yeah.
So I think if Benitez could win a game in any way, he would want to win it tactically.
Yeah.
Whereas if you look at his 2 trophies with Liverpool, one was that incredible comeback in Istanbul, which, he changed things at half-time, but that was more about, the old-fashioned kind of passion and never say die spirit. And then there was that, the next one was the FA Cup final, where Gerrard just had a storming game. And so the 2 trophies he's got were not really down to tactics.
Yeah.
But I think he always wants to promote himself as a tactician. Whereas if Harry Redknapp won a game through tactics, I don't think he'd want to say that.
Yeah.
I think he'd want to say, I've got the right players in, I picked the right team, that kind of thing. It's almost like tactics is a dirty word for that kind of old school English manager.
Yeah. And what do you think went wrong for Redknapp at Birmingham this season? Because I've got a friend who supports Birmingham City, and I think it was the day before he got sacked. We're in the pub discussing it. He was quite excited about going to the game, and I said, Redknapp's not going to last. He'll be gone in no time at all. And he was convinced that Birmingham were playing quite well, that he would last. And then, the next day he was gone.
Yeah, I must say I haven't seen any of Birmingham's full matches this season, so I can't comment with too much authority. But I think throughout his time in the Premier League, Redknapp generally liked flair players. He wasn't a kind of back to basics, get it up to the big man. He liked good players. You look at that Tottenham team; they had Bale and Lennon on the flanks, and then Modric and Van der Vaart as 2 of their 3 midfielders, and sometimes Huddleston as well, who was a great passer of the ball. And I think dropping to that level, you maybe can't so much rely upon great technical talents, because the Championship, as people always say, is a hard slog.
Yeah.
It's 46 games, it's often not great pitches, the refereeing is a bit more lenient, you're getting tough tackles, and I think, without a couple of flair players to depend upon, which Redknapp always has. Even at QPR, he had someone like Tarabs, who he really got the best from. I'm not sure Birmingham had that calibre of player, really.
Yeah. Okay, so let's kind of move on to the next topic. And really, this is kind of what can we expect to see this season in terms of tactics across the division? Are there kind of new strong trends coming through? And is there anything that a mid-table side like Southampton could do to perhaps break the monopoly on the big 6 teams?
To start with the end question, I actually don't think so. I think a mixture of the fact that the big 6 sides are pretty strong at the moment, and they have got good managers. There's been times in the past where you've had good teams who have had, an Avram Grant in charge, or Pellegrini when everyone knew he was going to get sacked, or the David Moyes era at United, the Hodgson era at Liverpool. We don't have any of that. We've got probably 5 of the best 8 or 9 managers in Europe, I think, and it's just going to be really hard to topple them. I think the tactical trends, I think there's 2 things to say here. One is that there's still a little bit of a fixation upon 3 at the back because of Chelsea's success last year and Tottenham's success last year. Although, having said that, I think I'm right in saying only 4 teams played 3 at the back last weekend. nevertheless, I do think that it's just something that's come into the game that we didn't see 4 or 5 years ago. And at the top, I think the really interesting thing is you've got 6 managers from 6 different countries. So you've got Wenger's from France, Guardiola's from Spain, Mourinho's from Portugal, Conte from Italy, Klopp from Germany, and Pochettino from Argentina. And to a certain extent, they all kind of embody those styles. And so that's what I'm finding quite interesting when you get 2 managers coming up against each other. If you have a kind of Chelsea against Manchester City last weekend, you had a real kind of old school Italian manager in Conte who was about structure and defensive organisation. And then you had a manager in Guardiola who wanted his team playing possession football, who wanted to get his attackers into space. And I think just seeing how those kind of battles, unfold has been really interesting so far. And I must say, for the rest of the Premier League, I think it's, and again, this refers back to the end question, which I answered first. I'm not sure there's any teams that are really pushing to be either challenging the top teams or just doing something interesting tactically, to be honest. And I find it a little bit depressing almost when it's come to match of the day, because there's a lot of games that don't feel that inspiring for the neutral. And you only need 3 teams, let's say. Southampton when they're under Pochettino, even West Ham when they're under Bilic, when Payet was on form, and Newcastle in form under Benitez. Yeah. But there just don't seem to be any really interesting teams, not necessarily just quality, but teams who are doing something different. I'm not sure we have that. Maybe the one exception, and I must say that I've only seen one of their games this season, is Watford under Marco Silva, and I'm seeing them on Saturday for the first time live. So maybe looking forward to that. But I think it's a little bit of a dull Premier League this season.
I was wondering if you might mention Marco Silva's Watford, and there was a lot of talk around Southampton potentially getting Silva in as the manager after Claude Puel, but we hadn't actually set Puel by the time that he was appointed at Watford. But certainly in the game against Southampton, they looked really interesting, and I would say they would probably be my pick for anyone to kind of come up and break that mould. I think lots of people had high hopes for Koeman's Everton, but as you mentioned before, they've got a lot of issues themselves, and I don't think they've spent their money particularly well. Sad to say, I don't think Southampton are going to be the team that season. It seems that the problems and the reasons why we sacked Claude Puel at the end of last season seem to still be haunting us this season, and I'm not really sure that Pellegrino has made his mark on Southampton yet.
Yes, I mean, it's been quite flat so far, hasn't it? Kind of continuation of last season, really. I mean, from what I've seen, the defence looks very well organised and open play. Conceded a couple of sloppy goals from set pieces.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's about going forward, isn't it? And I do wonder whether you have the midfield creativity, really, in terms of not just the kind of someone playing the assists, because you have sometimes Tadic is on form, sometimes he's not, but he can do that. But just, I'd be interested to know what you think of Lamina, who's clearly a talented player, but I think is, I'm not quite sure he's what you need alongside Romeo. I'd be interested to know what you think about the balance of that.
I can see where you're coming from in the fact that they're perhaps too defensively minded midfielders. However, from what I've seen from Lamina, he is a wonderful player to watch. I'd say he's got the Wanyama kind of bullying nature when it comes to the defensive action. He seems to have a mind like Morgan Schneidlin's, and he seems to have a few little tricks up his sleeve as well. He was really fantastic against Crystal Palace when we beat them. I mean, admittedly against a poor Palace side. I guess we haven't seen an awful lot from him going forward, but he does seem to be more attacking minded, than perhaps Oriol Romeo or even Wanyama was.
Yeah, certainly more of a little bit of a box-to-box play, maybe not with that dynamism. But I think that the reason I worry slightly about him is he came from Juventus and he played a kind of jack-of-all-trades role.
Yeah.
He played left wing this week, he played defensive midfield this week, he'd kind of go wherever. And Juventus are really good at producing that kind of player and using that kind of player. But I often think when they go to other teams, and you saw this with Giaccherini at Sunderland, who did a really good job for Juve, but then when you're put into a team and it's a completely different situation, you go from being the kind of 12th man, if you like, to someone who's got to really stamp your authority on the team. I think psychologically that's a big shift, really, and especially in terms of coming to a new league. I do like Southampton's first 11. I like. I've been saying Stephen Davis is underrated for so long, but it seems like everyone thinks that now, so he's not underrated anymore. But it's just whether you have the kind of real ball player from deep. I think from the Southampton games I've seen, I haven't seen that much kind of invention from deep positions, despite the fact the three central midfielders are quite good technically.
Yeah. I would reserve judgment on Lamina until you get a chance to see him in the flesh, because having seen him play, I was really, really impressed. I think he is going to be a big star in the Premier League. Hopefully I'm proved right. I get what you mean about the kind of ball playing, from in deep, and I actually think maybe the player to do that could be Wesley Hoot, our new signing. He seems to have a wonderful left foot and can ping a ball, 40 or 50 yards, pick out Tadic, normally with his left foot going across the pitch, so out to whoever's playing on the right seems to be the way forward. But really, we do rely a lot on our wing-backs, or I suppose left back and right back, depending on what the formation that we're playing. But Bertrand and Cedric Suarez getting up and putting crosses in. But the problem is we no longer have a Pella or a Lambert type player. And that seems to be where a lot of our issues are coming from. We have the kind of forwards that need someone from midfield unlocking it, but we're still playing kind of wings and crosses for someone who should be a big number 9.
Yeah, and I think, from what I've seen, it does seem like that is just a problem with the players rather than something the manager can necessarily change. I can't really work out quite how Southampton will kind of define themselves in the attacking phase of play. And you look at the goals scored figure, not just the fact that they haven't scored many overall, but I think I'm right saying no one scored more than once. So it's not even like you've got a player in a little bit of form who you can kind of base your team around. So, I mean, you hope that it will improve with more time on the training ground, but it feels like they are at least one player short of just pushing for that 7th place, I'd say.
Yeah, I think January would be interesting to see if we do kind of pick up some more players. The next thing I think that might be interesting to talk about is when you go and watch a match and looking for the tactics. What's the best perspective? Do you like watching it on the television? Do you like being in the ground? Do you like being high up, low up? How do you really kind of set out your idea when it comes to looking at the games?
Yeah, I mean, in general, I prefer to be at the games, but at games where you have an elevated view. If you're sitting very low, I find it really difficult to read the game and to see the patterns there. So in that sense, I'd rather kind of watch it on TV with an elevated camera angle than be in a bad position. But yeah, I don't think there's anything better than having an elevated view of a game. You can just see the formations and you can see the gaps and the space and the players that are exploiting it. I think that's crucial. I mean, the only caveat to that is, if you're watching it on television and I'm doing a report or whatever, then you have got the pause and rewind, and just watching things twice is super helpful, especially after a goal or whatever. But yeah, I'm surprised that managers always sit in dugouts, because I think generally they get a very poor view. And, you go 10, 15 years ago, and Sam Allardyce always used to sit up in the stands. And I've seen him questioned a couple of times about why he now sits downstairs. And he can't really put his finger on it. So I assume it's just because he likes shouting abuse at the 4th official and the referee. Because you think, Allardyce, for all his critics, is a very kind of methodical thinker. He does things for a reason, but he hasn't been able to explain what that reason is. So it must be something underhand. Yeah.
Michael, I've noticed that you've got quite a few notes with you today. So I don't want to have missed out on any gems that you may have researched previous to this podcast. So are there any topics that we haven't covered yet that you'd like to get onto?
Nothing in particular. I mean, just one thing. I went through and I looked at all the goals Southampton scored and conceded so far this year. And one thing that came to mind, and it's something I've had a bit of a thing about for the last couple of years, is... Well, it was really a question for you. I wondered what your opinion on Fraser Forster would be, because I've heard a lot of good things about him with Celtic, and almost before I'd seen him that regularly. But whenever I see him, I'm disappointed in his kicking. I always think he looks a bit suspect from long range, maybe because of his footwork. I mean, I'm really not an expert on goalkeeping, the worst goalkeeper in the world. but I always think he looks a bit static. And just seems to make a few too many errors for me as well, just unforced errors. So, it's the position you don't really talk about in terms of tactics. But I'd be intrigued to know what you think of him.
I know there's going to be a lot of listeners, on the tube or driving to work or whatever, listening to this, nodding their heads, thinking, "Yep, you've hit the nail on the head with Fraser Forster." He is suspect from long range, and he does seem to struggle to get down, particularly to shots that are fired low. But what he is brilliant at is the kind of close range shots, and I really like Fraser Forster. He's done the best goalkeeping performance which I've ever seen, which was at the Emirates a couple of years ago.
Yeah, how was that game? That was incredible. Yeah,
0-0, and it was just unbelievable. Every time you thought, oh, here would come Arsenal, we're bound to concede at this time. And I have no idea how many shots on target Arsenal had that day, but it must have been, into double figures. And Fraser Forster was incredible throughout that whole game. And I was behind that goal for one of the halves where we just faced this constant onslaught. So I've always thought he's a really, really great goalkeeper in that sort of situation, but he definitely does have his suspect moments. And I think it's quite telling that he got dropped from the England squad, not this time round, but last time round. I think his stock does appear to be going down.
Yeah, I mean, it seemed like maybe 18 months ago he was next in line. Joe Hart was wobbling there. Yeah. Well, he'd been wobbling for a long time. But now it seems with, yesterday it was Butland who started instead. Pickford, seems to be doing well for Everton, had a good season at Sunderland. Not sure about Tom Heaton. I think he's probably... I think I'd probably take Forster over him. But, it seems like he's going to be destined to remain in the shadows rather than, be a first choice for England, which seemed inevitable at one point, which I guess is just the fact you can have a regular English Premier League goalkeeper that isn't automatically in the squad is a bit of an improvement from 10 years ago when we were kind of having to dip into the Championship. I remember when Rob Green and David James were in the Championship and were getting in the England squad. But it's good for England to have options, I guess. Yeah,
and I think, we've seen a few glimmers in the last couple of fixtures where perhaps he's looking a bit better. So hopefully, this has been a little bit of a blip in his career, but certainly the last kind of 6 months or so haven't been particularly good for him. So I'm interested to know kind of what's next for Michael Cox. What have you got coming up? Have you ever been invited to give kind of tactical insights or scouting reports for any clubs, or have any clubs ever approached you on your thoughts for things?
A couple of times actually, but it wasn't something I really wanted to pursue on a kind of full-time professional basis, and it's something you really have to go in for. You know, maybe surprisingly, you can't kind of do it part-time. They want you working in the club in-house, and I wanted to be a journalist and do this kind of thing. So I enjoyed writing the book and hopefully do something along those lines again. But what I'm doing now this season really is the Totally Show, as you mentioned, which is a bit of a breakaway effort from the old Guardian Football Weekly podcast. But that's tremendous fun and, is going really well. I think we've got a good selection of guests, and obviously James Richardson is, I guess for people of our age, is kind of the football presenter. Certainly from my point of view is, Football Italia was the thing that got me into football, really. So, that's always fun to do. But, just looking to go to a lot of matches this season because the book took a lot of researching and maybe didn't get to pay so much attention to the day-to-day Premier League stuff. But there's still a few sides I'm yet to see live, and I'm very aware one of them is Southampton. Yeah. So I think I'm at St Mary's in start of next month, maybe. But I always enjoy going down there. I always enjoy the train ride down there.
Yeah. No, it's a nice little ride down from London, obviously where I live as well. Maybe we'll give you a call once you've seen Southampton. You can give us a little bit more of an insight into Pellegrino and what's going wrong or what's going right, hopefully, by that stage. Hopefully,
I'll have to pick my game carefully because it sounds like there's been some shockers recently. But, hopefully things will get better.
So do you want to tell everyone about where they can find your book? Is it going to be... It's in hardback at the moment. Are we going to see a softback? What am I saying? Paperback.
Not for a while actually. Not until early next year. Yeah, it's available in hardback from the usual bookstore places. I probably don't need to plug them. It's also available on an ebook if you're that way inclined. Also on audiobook, which I must admit, until this came out, I'd never listened to an audiobook before, but the guy, I don't do the reading, you'll be relieved to hear. The guy who does the reading, called Colin Mace, who's an incredible voice actor who does the appropriate accents and impressions of everyone I've quoted in the book.
Really?
Which I've quoted literally hundreds of people from, Geordies to Americans to South Africans to Georgians like Georgie Kinkladze. And just the range of accents is, I'd say, probably more impressive than the actual content of the book. So, yeah, if you like podcasts, maybe the audiobook might suit your needs.
Yeah. I would say to listeners, absolutely go down to the bookstore, get the mixer, put it on your birthday list, put it on your Christmas list if you're going to have to wait that long. But it's a really, really fascinating book to read. Despite it being enormous, you do whiz through it quite quickly because, it's quite addictive in the way you kind of keep on getting on. It's like, I wonder who he's going to mention next, which manager is going to be coming up, and definitely worth listening to reading, and probably also worth listening to the Mixer podcast where you go through each position in the side episode by episode and get to talk those through as well.
Yeah, that was a kind of accompanying thing. And it's just Premier League nostalgia, I guess. Kind of Premier League years, but maybe a little bit more in depth in the tactical side of things. But thank you for your kind words.
Yeah. All right, everyone. So we're going to wrap up now. Thank you very much for listening. As always, do send us any feedback. We're on Twitter at SaintsFC Podcast. You can email us saintsfcpodcast@gmail.com. But most of all, tell all of your friends to subscribe to the Saints FC Podcast on iTunes and give us a lovely review as well. Thank you very much for joining us this evening, Michael. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Cheerio.